Jonathan Zittrain, of course, really doesn't need an introduction to a Harvard audience, since he is a very central figure around here for all things connected to the internet, not least of all because he wrote a book called The Future of the Internet and How to Stop It. That's the kind of book that just makes you instantly famous. We are also in,
I'm working on a sequel called Well, We Tried.
This comment actually kind of anticipates what I meant to say next and last before turning over to him. One thing I always think when I see Jonathan in action is that this guy really should do a talk show. Because he's so tremendously...
Highest academic compliment ever.
He is just so tremendously entertaining. So now that I have raised the stakes for the last session of the day tremendously high, please join me in welcoming Jonathan Zittrain.
Thank you. Thank you very much, although I must say Max Tegmark is a rough act to follow. For that. So I don't have a totally polished prime-time presentation today, but rather wanted to just share some thoughts and provocations in progress that I've been working on as I've been thinking about this field roughly of governance and ethics of AI, and particularly having the benefit of some folks that you saw a representative panel of earlier from our Techtopia program. I've just found it incredibly rewarding to meet them, to work with them, both as a group in our sessions and to talk one-on-one. And some of the ideas today are ideas that I found myself homing as I talked with some of them in this very room. And you know who you are, or soon as the mic is not working.
Yeah.
I have a green light on. It's perhaps the singularity has happened, and they don't like what I'm going to say.
Excellent.
There we go. Well, it's cutting in and out.
Yeah, it's cutting in and out. I would prefer to use that handle. Unless it doesn't seem like
Put that on the
I'm going to put my phone in airplane mode, not that that's ever made a difference. But I got to say, I'm flying now. All right. How are we now? Whoa, makes you wonder what my phone is doing. All right. That was my fault for staying at a Marriott property worldwide. Okay. So, do I have to reintroduce the whole thing, or is what I said sufficiently? You heard it. It's just, is this being webcast?
Yes.
Okay, well, a great shout out to the trolls out there. Thank you for your many comments. So, just a few thoughts then. First, an analogy I've been working on, you can tell me how well it fits, which is maybe not a bumper sticker slogan, but AI is the new asbestos. It's not itself a retail product. It gets embedded in other stuff. When you look to see what stuff it's embedded in, it's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. And it can have great benefits, which is why it ends up being embedded. That, though, can lead to unexpected problems later on, which it would be great to avoid, and it can be awfully hard to rip out once you've decided you don't want it anymore. And that really poses a dilemma that I have found particularly sharpened because in my work and study of the internet and its development, its architecture, there has been what I've called a procrastination principle. Build it. Yes, you can think about all the problems that can happen, but just build it and deal with the problems as they come up. And I've spoken very approvingly of those principles, but here the equities might be quite different, especially if the rip-outable situation is different than it is with, just unplug that code that didn't work so well on the internet. So I see this as already a zeroth dilemma. And when we think a little bit, and if there's any organizing theme to the thoughts I'm sharing today, it's thinking about the regulatory environment that might emerge around this stuff. It's trying to figure out a question of whether everything should be permitted until it's prohibited. We also think of that as the internet way of doing things, and certainly close to the Silicon Valley way of doing things. The actual Silicon Valley way of doing things is just do it whether or not it's prohibited, versus it's all prohibited until it's specifically permitted, the kind of licensing thing. And that seems like pretty strong regulatory medicine in the United States in 2018. That's not really a recipe that people recognize, but it's worth thinking about the panoply of options. Okay, another thought about machine learning in particular as a flavor of AI and thinking about regulations is a phrase that came up as I was talking with one of our techtopians, C who cannot be named. By C I mean a constant, a variable of some kind rather than Voldemort. But machine learning as a way of not, as you would say in an expert system, having to foreground and make explicit your policy preferences or your criteria of judgment. Now, in I think the circles that we roughly identify ourselves as in, who are studying AI, ethics, etc., we think of it, that when we talk about the problem of explainability, we're not talking about things are too explainable. They need to be more recondite. But in law, I think de facto we have areas in which explainability and interpretability are disfavored. The jury is a great example, that we take what is otherwise a process dominated by officials, by state agents and officers licensed of the court, not permitted to practice law until they say you can, and then we stick into the middle of it in the civil and criminal trial a jury of people who are chosen specifically because they are utterly ignorant of the facts of the case before them when they come in. If they knew the parties or anything about it, they would not be allowed to be on the jury. And they would be looked at askance if they had any substantive expertise on the topic of the case. A blood spatter expert would be excused from the murder trial jury, but rather instead expected to turn up as an expert. And when the jury hears all the evidence, it is to retire in complete confidence, as in confidentiality, and then utter a verdict, speak the truth. They do not speak truth and beauty, Max, just truth, it seems. They utter their verdict, and then the ideal is they're never heard from again. Thank you for your service, please return to your jobs. Here's your $5 for your day of service, and that's it, which is weird. But it's, as my colleague Charlie Nesson surmised a long time ago, it's part of the social acceptability function of the role of the jury not to explain itself, because as soon as it's explaining, you can be seeing flaws in its reasoning and disagreeing, but rather to utter a simple answer and walk, and the fact that they were people like you is enough to have you have confidence in their confidential process. Now, whether, of course, machine learning works in that role, given that it is not people like us, but rather algorithms inserted into those different places that are the asbestos moments of the system, is a good question. But it's worth pointing out that in law, often the parlor trick, and maybe this is like the cult of magicians revealing how the trapdoor works when they shouldn't, at key moments, legitimacy of the system depends on our ignorance of how it's working. That's a feature, not a bug. Now, whether that's good or bad is another question, but it is, I think, descriptively true. And we see it not just at the jury level, but we see it across different areas of the law when courts are offered some kind of formula, algorithm, expert system to better mechanize and therefore maybe make fair and equal to equal litigants their processes and their decisions. So this is from the not so famous case of BMW versus Gore in 1996. No, it's not that Gore. And this was a guy whose BMW was shipped from Germany. I don't know how many people remember when there was free trade. So things used to come in from outside the country and we'd pay less for them. But this guy ordered a car. It came from Germany. There was some bad weather on the way. The car's paint got a little chipped. So the dealer repainted the whole thing and then sold it as a new car and represented it as an unrepainted new car, which was a lie, which meant that when Gore figured this out, he sued. His compensatory damages were quite minimal because it was a really good repainting job. But the punitive damages to prevent this fraud were, I think, in 1996 dollars. This is when the dollar still meant something too. It was like $20 million. And this gets appealed then through the Alabama court system and ultimately to the United States Supreme Court, where one of the things the lawyers went back and forth about was, is it a problem under the 8th Amendment, the amendment you might know as it being about cruel and unusual punishment? Here we're talking about excessive fines being imposed, or bail. And the idea was, well, if the multiplier between actual and punitive damages is too big, is that something that should impeach the amount under the 8th Amendment? And Justice Stevens says, of course, we have consistently rejected the notion that the constitutional line is marked by a simple mathematical formula here. It's almost like it would demean the Constitution if its parsing were simple. But they also, I think, include in this a rejection of a complicated mathematical formula. The problem is not that the mathematical formula is not complicated enough. It's that there is one at all. The Supreme Court and its siblings and nephews and spawns, I guess plural spawn is spawn, each of these institutions at some key moment articulate, as many of the law people in the room can tell you, a balancing test. So you just put all the factors into a pot and you stir them and the answer bubbles to the top as part of a delicious stew. This is not a metaphor I will keep using. But that's the kind of idea, balancing test. And then the judge, in writing an opinion, which is supposed to be an explanation of the judge or justice's thinking, says, yes, I balanced all these factors very carefully, and today's winner is welfare, or whatever it is between justice, welfare, or some other factor. They're rejecting the math, which is interesting because the engineers among us, the computer scientists, are sometimes saying, that's crazy. If we can operationalize some of the variables here, it could better humanity. But it's not something the courts are used to. I see gerrymandering as another example of this. There's more than one gerrymandering case percolating within the US Supreme Court right now. But this is one from 2004. Fairness does not seem to us a judicially manageable standard. It's compatible with too many different things. And to try to capture it in anything that feels algorithmic, that feels step by step and rational, kind of dispossesses the whole process of this aura of flexibility, fairness, judgment that maybe the courts are wanting to encourage. Okay, so that's one question on the table. Here is a second related question I found myself wondering about. Can something be fair from a systems point of view, genuinely fair, while genuinely unfair from the individual's point of view? And if so, is it fair? And I don't purport to have answered this question, at least not yet. I don't know the answer. But I found myself in teaching a reading group on the now kind of well-trod, in the sense that we all know there's a big issue there, but not necessarily solved topic of bail and predictive risk scores and such. This chart from the Washington Post's Monkey Cage blog of the big debate inspired when ProPublica, through Julia Angwin, did its expose on the COMPAS algorithm from North Point, since renamed to something else, I forget what. But they're the company formerly known as North Point. What is it? Equivent. It also sounds like something you take 3 times a day and maybe your headache goes away. So yes, from Equivent, thank you. And here, there's a claim of racial bias in the scores that the COMPAS system is spitting out to advise a judge on how much the person in front of the judge is at risk of rearrest, since that's the kind of data it was trained on. And it's a pretty good summary here of the debate between the two. North Point says, our system is fair because the proportion of defendants who recidivate in each category is about the same regardless of race. And that does appear to be the fact, that if you are assigned through your input data to a low risk category, then it's right about your not recidivating 2/3 of the time for each discriminating category here by race. And if it puts you in the medium/high category, it is again of equal predictive value. And therefore, says North Point, it's fair. On the other hand, ProPublica looks at exactly the same data and says, this is unfair because black defendants who don't recidivate are disproportionately predicted to be riskier, I don't know why there's a typo there, than their white counterparts. And that's because if you look at the actual size of the stacks here, if you're in this category, notice that the medium-high stack is just taller, reflecting rearrest rates, which in turn could reflect any number of bad policing practices, let's be clear. But if we're just judging it not on, is it making more efficient a racist society, probably not the bumper sticker that North Point would want for its product, but if you just look at it as, is it simply capturing the rearrest rate? Indeed, it is, but it does mean you will be, if you are in this do not reoffend category, there are many more of you in this chart that did not reoffend than there are here. And another way to think about this then, and this is one of the ways in which somebody challenging the use of the compass system is Wisconsin, the somewhat famous Loomis case. One of their claims was a right to an individualized sentence, which is seen, put forth as an element of due process. And I say put forth because as best I can tell, the Supreme Court has not yet chosen to accept it. So I don't know that I can say in America you have a right to an individualized sentence. What's more, I'm not sure I know what it would mean to have a right to an individualized sentence. I guess it would mean, sorry, Cynthia, are you wanting to?
I do know what it would mean.
Oh, so we have a contestant. Professor Dork, is there something simple or?
It would be simpler with a whiteboard, but.
You could do it once, but then it would be forever ruined.
It would no longer be white.
Yes.
The question is, where is your uncertainty coming from?
Yes.
So for the people who were at my talk last night, when I said you should ask what the probability space is, this is why.
Yes.
So for the individualized sentence, you want to essentially say you have so much information about this individual that the only uncertainty that's left is the uncertainty in the environment around.
The uncertainty in
So
the
in other words, the
environment
person
around.
interacts with an environment.
Yes.
Let's forget about the fact that we also have randomness inside our own heads and we have free will. Let's just, but.
Surely we can put that aside.
No, you can
Yes.
include it. So the probability space is the randomness inside yourself and the
Yes.
randomness in the environment that you interact with.
Yes.
And an individualized sentence would perhaps have something to do with what is your personal probability with this notion of probability.
Yes. So I
As
just.
opposed to in the other where you're saying we reach into a group of people
Yes.
of whom a certain fraction are going to receive
Yes.
it.
So I love your conception of self such that there could be something called a personalized probability, which is to say a probability based only on one's innate characteristics
And the interactions with the environment.
and the interaction with the environment prospectively, which is to say, of course, who can, there's a storm coming, you all look like you would loot, and therefore, right, we don't do that. So it's just anything that would not be knowable, or only things that would be knowable about the individual at the moment the individual stands before the court, is what you're saying, correct?
It's close to correct.
Well, I'll take it. Hey, this is machine learning. I'll take a 95% confidence interval here. But in some ways, I like that. Now, let's be clear. What Cynthia said she would offer is a definition. And I like that definition about what an individualized sentence would mean. The only problem with the definition is it supposes a state of nirvana that simply isn't reflected in any plausible courtroom environment. It assumes a can opener. That it asks us then, I think quite nicely, it squarely puts the question of when we do not have that degree of knowledge about the person standing in front of us, may we, or when may we, lean on proxies that are in fact not personal predictions, but are generalizations from characteristics that that person may share with the rest of the world that are predictively accurate, but maybe not fair. And to take it out of a sensitive context, or mostly sensitive context, imagine that it's just If I'm wearing red trousers, that turns out through careful observation of who recidivates later and gathering just all data possible, that red trousers correlates 90% to recidivating. And it's surely a proxy. It's not like if you have red trousers, people start attacking you and then you overfight back and you get arrested. It's a proxy for membership in some kind of gang or something, the red trouser gang. And 90%. So it's admitting, this statistic is saying it's not 100% correlation. There will be people who walk into the room with red trousers who are in the 10%, roughly 1 out of 10. And when they have a risk score pop out that says 9 on a scale of 1 to 10, and therefore their bail is made very high or they are not granted bail, have they been treated fairly? And I think, I don't know, so do you have an easy answer to that question?
Solon has an answer.
Oh, wow, all right. This is like the curtain call. This is great. We're bringing together the band. Yes.
Only if it's not disruptive, Jitsi. Tell me.
Say what?
Yeah, only if it's not disruptive, if you want to continue.
People feel this is disruptive? No, this is a kind of crappy deck. I mean, this is not like I got
Fight
pictures
disruption.
or something. Yeah.
So I mean, I'll start by saying this is Fred Shower's argument. Fred Shower is a law professor at the University of Virginia, has this beautiful book.
The former Stanton chair at the Harvard Kennedy School.
Exactly.
So Fred has this book, I think it's called Stereotypes, Profiles, and something or other.
Yes.
And it's this question, in part, it's sort of reflecting on the idea that we might want individualized judgment, but making predictions about people
That's
based
pretty good,
on,
wasn't it?
yeah, on using induction as a mechanism by which we are going to predict the way they will behave in the future.
Yes.
Means that we necessarily have to compare them to like cases. And so we have to generalize. There is no such thing as being able to make a prediction about an outcome you haven't yet seen, right? Unless we're going to say that they are like in some way these other cases we've observed in the past. And so every decision, and even if we imagine it being individualized, is always with reference to other people who resemble them in some way. So I have a hard time imagining how you can have individualized judgment in any circumstances with machine learning, which by definition is generalizing from examples. And so I wonder the same thing in this case. We might say, like, we wanted to take into consideration all the relevant factors that might sway the judge or jury, and for whatever reason, this existing process does not.
Yes.
But to argue that you get to the point where you consider someone in their full uniqueness, they fail to resemble people, and therefore you have no way of making a prediction because you've never seen anyone like them before.
You are presented with a Martian.
That's it.
And it's like, here's a Martian. They stole some candy. What do you want to do? Will they do it again? I don't know. Yeah. Well, so wait, but I thought you were suggesting. I thought you were going to do the old academic. This is old news. Fred Shower solved this years ago with a book. You're just saying he also said this was a problem.
So he says that often this desire for individualized treatment is the desire for taking into consideration the genuinely relevant details that would differentiate people, and that
How would the red trousers work for him, or for you?
I think it's I think he would probably start by saying that he's not thinking of scenarios where we are assigning significance to things that on their face don't seem relevant, right? It's sort of the expectations that we can delineate those things which are genuinely relevant to the assessment. And so if someone were to say red trousers, he would probably say, that's not what I'm concerned with. I'm trying to say, as a, let's say, defendant, I can marshal further evidence that would further distinguish me from these other people that you should have been considering when you made this prediction.
Uh-huh.
But still, to the point, like, I think his argument is that the burden to seek out further information, to further distinguish yourself from more people to the point where you're like getting close to not being lumped in with people who are dissimilar, will be costly. And often the way we justify not making individualized decisions in the sense of getting more and more information about people is by saying that it would just be too expensive. And there might be some situations where we acknowledge that that's a reasonable defense against invariably lumping in people with others who are going to be dissimilar from them with respect to this outcome.
So I should let Cynthia get in again, but while the mic is going over, only if she wants, if we accept that choice of trousers is not a sensitive category, which again, maybe there's an argument that it is, but say it isn't, and it is in fact predictive, maybe it's 99% predictive, we can turn the dial as far as we want. You're saying on some form of a declaration that it is not, quote, relevant, because not causal.
No, it would be relevant in this case, but I think he's thinking of like, I'm going to add an additional detail to what, I'm going to add an additional detail to what you're considering that turns that remaining 1% of error, in my case, into a much smaller percent error, because now you're doing something else which allows you to further subdivide the group.
Yes, that's called another can opener. We now have 2 can openers, we've assumed. Which is great when you have them, but when you don't, and of course, again, think about the system. The stakes are quite high here. People's freedom is at stake. This is happening day by day down the street at the Cambridge courthouse and elsewhere. And there are loaded stakes on both sides. If people are set free who are going to commit other crimes, possibly violent ones, that's bad. If you're putting people in jail on the basis of others' behavior that has nothing to do with them, that seems bad too. It really hones the issue of fairness by the system to fairness to the individual. Cindy, was there more you wanted to say at this juncture, or?
No, I've been thinking about exactly these things very hard for the last month or so.
Yes.
But it's in process still.
Joshua Simons wants to get in, and I don't know if you want to reveal yourself as the person that has been talking to me about this and vice versa, but you don't really need to, yeah.
Just one question about whether the right thing that we're focusing on is whether it's individualized or the kind of judgment that you're assuming we're dealing with here. So if you're talking about prediction, then you're making an assumption about the right kind of judgment in this context, so whether it's sentencing or parole or whatever. And one answer to the question of why it might be individualized is because previously we set it up as a backward-looking judgment. So it's necessarily individualized in a certain kind of way, because what we're looking at is your past record. Whereas when we turn this into a prediction problem, we're asking for a different kind of judgment, which is necessarily not individualized in
You're saying if we were to base a prediction on your future behavior by only using as inputs your past behavior, you'd feel real comfortable with that.
Well, I can't remember whether we're talking about sentencing or parole, because they're slightly different questions.
Yes.
I think we were talking about no, we're talking about parole, aren't we? Because
No,
we're talking about
sentence.
We're talking about sentencing, great.
It keeps changing. But
Oh wow, you just changed it. That was amazing. So if we're talking about sentences, that is a backward, well, we've historically thought of that in criminal justice as a backward-looking judgment. And therefore it's bound to a certain kind of individualized form of evidence in a way that...
To the extent that the sentence is based on a moral, if not retribution, this is the dessert you have earned, this is your moral dessert for what you've done, or if you're thinking about incapacitation, you're making a future judgment about whether they're going to kill again.
Right, and this is based on a conversation that Cynthia and I have had a few weeks ago, but it depends, the question of whether it's individualized, what I'm trying to say is it follows from a question about how you think you ought to set up the kind of judgment.
Yes.
So like if you think sentencing ought to be a
Yes.
retributivist thing, then
Yes.
it necessarily has to be both individualized and backward looking. If you think the purpose of sentencing is to deter, future
Certainly
cases,
some
then it's a
aspect of the
different kind
system is forward-looking, and certainly parole would be, if we're letting you out.
When you set it up as a prediction problem, then you
Yes.
bound those set of possibilities. You make it only about
Yes.
that kind of thing.
And
So
is
you
it
lose the
okay to make predictions when they aren't individualized, or to the extent they are not as individualized as Cynthia would have them be, with a formula that if we could achieve it would be great? Yeah. Here's another example just to put on the table in another context that came up with the set of Princeton case studies that Ed Felton's group and others at CITP at Princeton have been doing. We had one case study called Hiring by Machine, which presupposes a company that happens to hire a lot of military veterans. Those veterans tend to succeed quite well. They find the culture within the company, a fit of culture, to be very important, and they try to automate their hiring through machine learning as to who has succeeded and who hasn't on the basis of what they can glean from the incoming CVs. And through that, there is detected a strong correlation between physical activity and success at the company. And the job, however, the literal job is like coding, but the culture is such that outdoorsy, active types are the most successful. And somebody who is wheelchair bound applies and is immediately filtered out because they have none of the physical activity on the resume that the algorithm is looking for. And I realize you could have two objections in that person's, the applicant's position. One would be, I'm a corner case. Once I reveal this further fact, you'll see that, oh, you wouldn't even have a possibility of the traditional mountain climbing activities, and therefore to judge you on something you couldn't do, but maybe would be dispositionally inclined to do, might mean you would fit in with our culture, and we just overlooked you. Is that an example of the 10% materializing of a 90% likelihood? Maybe it is. And again, is it fair that they were filtered out at that early stage on that basis? And if it is unfair, is it because disability is a stop word? It's a immediate categorical problem as a basis for decision. And if that's the case, that maybe militates towards a regulatory regime that looks at, you can do whatever you want. You can filter out somebody who just happened not to be active for other reasons that aren't traceable to a claim of disability. And maybe you will regret, and they would regret, not having made it to an interview because they were in the 10% that would have fit. No ethical or legal claim, but if you stray into a sensitive category, you've got a real problem. And that starts to get very much into, say, Cynthia's work about how to try to program the system with just clear boundaries about where at least human review would be required given the kinds of judgments the thing is spitting out. And it's that kind of phenomenon, if I'm reading right, some ways of understanding the hypothetical in that case study, to say, is it possible that we can't say what's fair, but we can say what's unfair? And I think to a logician that seems weird, because if you can say what A is, you know what not A is, and vice versa, the contrapositive. But if you're not a logician, maybe it's, yeah, there's so many different ways to achieve fair, or to make decisions that from a given applicant pool, competing companies that do exactly the same thing, they happen to choose very different people, and we'd say each of them is quote unquote right, or at least not wrong, but there are some things they could be doing that would fall into the category of unfair. And maybe, again, that would lead towards, as I telegraphed earlier, a regulatory regime that's telling you what you can't do rather than what you must do, because what you must do has so many different incarnations, and what you can't do is more definable. I find this puzzle, as I've been working on a regulatory suggestion around information fiduciaries and privacy and what companies need to do to be loyal to their users, and found myself saying, I'm not sure I can say this and only this is loyal, but I can certainly say that this is disloyal when you, as Waze, give them the best route to somewhere, but the best route takes you past IHOP, because IHOP gave Waze $20 to, at lunchtime, slow them down as they pass. It's a really interesting question. And also, now to cross the streams, did find myself thinking about models of deploying this kind of targeted advertising, internet commerce advertising model to autonomous vehicles. So autonomous vehicles are free. You can just hail any of them with your phone. I don't know why I'm raising my hand. It's an old-fashioned gesture, strange Lovian, and hopefully not. And you hail the vehicle. It comes by. It'll take you for free, but you must idle for 10 minutes at the Wendy's drive-thru. It's just, hey, you don't have to buy something, but here it is, and you're not going anywhere for 10 minutes. You know, maybe we'll leave a little earlier if you start chewing. Would that be okay? It would give people rides who might otherwise not be able to afford them. On the other hand, it would feel possibly less free. Or, alternative model, it'll get you where you're going, but at least twice a week, the car will come to you unbidden and take you on a, quote, adventure to the nearby bowling alley. And, you know, they paid for that, and that's, anyway, I digress. So, okay, third thing to put on the table, inspired in part, just title-wise, by Mark Andreessen's somewhat famous article, Why Software is Eating the World, from the Wall Street Journal in 2011. I think it's most famous because of the headline. It's a great title. The article itself seems a little bit boring. I digress. But I'm wondering about what happens if machine learning starts eating the world, precisely because it works and it starts finding its level in lots of places where you can plug it in. What might we worry about on that? And so here's a couple thoughts. This is a great paper. I'm still digesting it and reading it more than once about hidden technical debt in machine learning systems. There's this overall concept of technical debt that as you merely patch a system rather than wholesale reworking it and reevaluating it over time, it starts to get more and more rickety. It's got more spaghetti code in it. The claim in this article is that machine learning systems are categorically more prone to technical debt than just your regular software project for all sorts of reasons, in part having to do with the data sets on which they operate growing stale. They themselves become inputs in unexpected places to other processes which weren't the original purpose of the program, so the predictions aren't well matched afterwards. They drift in ways that make those other downstream systems screw up. But basically, it's a real warning. But what it got me thinking about was a larger question of hidden intellectual debt caused by effective predictive systems. And what I mean by that is this wonderful article, not from the Harvard Law Review, on machine learning of three-dimensional right ventricular motion enables outcome prediction in pulmonary hypertension, a cardiac MR imaging study. Nice use of the colon. It actually shows that through the use of three-dimensional right ventricular motion imaging, you can train up a system with images from t=0, see who has dropped dead or otherwise been negatively impacted by a heart attack several years later, and just see if there's correlations. Correlations that a world-renowned cardiologist would not recognize in the original imaging, but in fact do appear to pretty well predict at the moment the person's standing there how they're going to be feeling a few years out. Now, in some ways, you could see implementing this before understanding what it is about the ventricular motion that is showing some kind of disease in progress or vulnerability or something. It's just, it works, get it out there. Start prescribing drugs, start knowing who needs to be monitored better, et cetera, et cetera. And later, we'll figure out the theory behind why the machine is getting it right. I'm calling that intellectual debt. It's leapfrogging us to a place of knowledge that we otherwise wouldn't find ourselves because we hadn't theorized our way to it. To have an experiment, usually you need a hypothesis and then you test it, and when you're right, you're like, I might have a theory on my hands. But ML, of course, inverts this. Now, this is not entirely new. I think of drugs like Nuvigil, which is the new Provigil, stay awake even more, and on patent. And if you look at, has anybody ever been like completely bereft of reading material, so you've read the insert of a prescription drug? I guess? Not that many? All right, there we go. It is a study in boredom. The most exciting part is like the little, molecular structure where they don't even tell you what this is. These just appear to be hexagons, but they're sulfur. Anyway, you have this insert, and then, if you look carefully enough, buried exactly halfway in where you are least likely to find yourself reading it, clinical pharmacology, mechanism of action, the mechanism to which armodafinil promotes wakefulness is unknown. All I know is it promotes unwakefulness when you read the insert, but that's a known mechanism. Why is it unknown? Because they just took a bunch of chemicals, they fed them to some hapless creature of the sort that Max Tegmark should want to protect, and they saw which ones dropped dead and which ones got happy. I'm not saying it's ethical, I'm saying it's how they do it. And when that happens, they're like, great, we have a winner. Time for a stage 1 trial. Does it kill you? No, time for a stage 2 trial. And before you know it, science, no, not science, engineering, medicine has advanced. This is intellectual debt previous to an explosion in machine learning, but it was in one particular field having to do with finding pills for people to take. My question to myself, to my fellow academics, to the world is, what happens when in more and more areas we can get answers by jumping to the back of the book and turning it upside down to look at the answer key? Which I realize is a very old reference, but that's quiz books used to, so like Rot 13 kind of thing. Anytime you're even seeing just plain old A/B testing, it's like, this is the right thing to get people to click to buy car insurance. Like, really? Who would ever hypothesize that was the right thing? But with enough A/B testing and enough viewers, you're like, yep, it works. And it's therefore a form of Promethean knowledge given to us that, what's the Arthur C. Clarke quote? Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, even to the people building it. That's the neat codicil attached to Clarke's observation with these technologies. And it's why people who are good at ML are so heavily valued by society. It's free answers without having to do the theoretical work to get to them. But that raises not only, of course, questions of ground truth. I put that in what if it doesn't work category, but questions of what if it does work. We will start to accrue intellectual debt. Now, the happy reaction to this might be, great, it just sets our agenda. Here's a bunch of cool stuff that we can try to reverse engineer and have a theory about, and that will keep academics busy. Maybe that's true. But I worry that with academics' busyness around that, not actually being relied upon for advancement of material comfort, but just as an interesting puzzle to solve, which, make no mistake, that's called the humanities, right? Like, I'm all in favor of a liberal arts university and education and function in society, but there is a strong, strong force, and I anecdotally would say a growing one, questioning the relevance of that kind of knowledge pursuit in the university. And the fact is, at least recently, I would think it is cross-subsidized. The universities are cranking out useful things for humanity. Like, we've been coasted on Jonas Salk for like a hell of a long time. He absolutely did not want to patent the vaccine for polio when confronted. He actually said, I have a recording of it somewhere, well, can you patent the sun? So it's like, actually, no, I don't want to hear that. It may be difficult if we find ourselves relying now on what we are producing concretely to the world as academics, as university. We should be careful about establishing that as our benchmark, because the function of going backwards to re-theorize, to pay off our intellectual debt to machine learning is causing us. That could be seen as but a frivolous pursuit. And of course, anybody can do machine learning pretty well. It's not clear you need the universities. In fact, where's the data? It's not the universities. It's not in the public. It's in the proprietary and the corporate hands. So I see that as a real interesting challenge for us. And I'm curious what others think about the prospect of machine learning in the world. And those are my 3 provocations. Thank you.